The first time I heard my brother describe me as a danger to myself and others. He was wearing a three-piece suit and speaking in the kind of slow, measured tone that people in rooms like that tend to believe without question. He stood at the front of the probate courtroom in Charleston and used words like erratic and delusional with the same confidence he used when closing real estate deals smoothly, without hesitation, as if the words cost him nothing. Behind him, my mother pressed a folded tissue to the corner of her eye. My father stared at the floor, with the practiced grief of a man performing sorrow for an audience. I sat perfectly still at the table beside my attorney, and said nothing. I kept my hands flat on my thighs, my breathing even, my face completely unreadable. And I thought about the small silver locket I was wearing around my neck. The one my grandmother had given me when I was 7 years old, the one I had quietly modified 3 weeks before any of this began. I thought about what was recorded inside it. And I waited. Before I tell you exactly what happened, when my attorney stood up and asked the judge for one final piece of evidence, I need to take you back to the afternoon. This whole thing started the afternoon. My grandmother's will was read aloud in the offices of a law firm on King Street, and the polite fiction my family had maintained for 30 years finally cracked open. My grandmother had built her restaurant from nothing. She opened the Palmetto Table in 1978 with $1,200, a borrowed stand mixer, and a shrimp and grits recipe that her own grandmother had written on the back of a church bulletin. Over the next 4 decades, she turned it into one of the most beloved restaurants in the Lowcountry, a James Beard semi-finalist 3 separate times, a place where locals and tourists sat side by side for 2 hours without looking at their phones. She ran it herself until she was 79. She made the biscuits herself until she was 81. When she died, she left behind a business valued at just under $3 million, a building on a corner lot that developers had been circling like hungry birds for years, and a will that left every single piece of it to me. Not to my brother. Not to my parents. To me. My brother is the charming one. He always has been. He is 41 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy smile that makes strangers trust him immediately. He had a successful real estate investment firm for a long time. The kind of firm where the brochures used words like legacy and curated. What most people did not know, what I had only recently discovered, was that his firm had been quietly hemorrhaging money for 2 years, the result of a series of spectacularly bad decisions, and one very serious margin call that he had been managing by borrowing from people who were not the kind of people you borrowed from without consequences. My grandmother knew. She had a sharp mind and a network of old friends who told her things, and she had watched my brother's choices for years with something that looked like grief but was really clear-eyed assessment. She loved him. She did not trust him with the thing she had built. She trusted me. I had worked in that restaurant since I was 9 years old. I knew how to break down a whole flounder, and how to calibrate the dining room humidity, so the biscuits rose right, and how to read a Saturday night reservation sheet like a weather map. I had a culinary degree from Johnson & Wales, and 5 years of management experience at a restaurant in Savannah, before I came home to help my grandmother, during what we thought was a temporary health scare that turned out to be her final 2 years. I had given up my apartment, my relationship, a promotion, to be there. My grandmother saw all of it. She left me the restaurant because she knew what it meant to me and because she knew I would protect it. The attorney finished reading the will. The room was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then, my brother laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was the kind of laugh that is meant to communicate how absurd something is. How obviously wrong. How quickly it will be corrected. He looked at my parents and then at me, and there was something behind his eyes that had nothing to do with amusement. He said that clearly our grandmother had not been in her right mind at the end. He said that the estate would need to be reviewed. He said it the way he said everything, with that smooth, patient confidence, as if he were simply explaining a situation that everyone else had failed to understand. My mother turned to me and said that of course the family would work this out together. She said it like a statement of fact, not a question. Like the matter was already settled and I simply needed to catch up. I looked at both of them, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not surprise. Not even hurt, exactly. It was more like the moment you press on a bruise you had forgotten was there, sudden and clarifying. I had spent my entire life watching my brother fail upward, while I held things together quietly. And watching my parents attribute every bright thing he did to talent, and every bright thing I did to luck or timing. I had watched them give him money I never asked for, and give me advice I never requested. I had watched them attend his firm's launch party and forget to ask about my promotion. I had absorbed it all for 30 years with the particular patience of a person who has decided it is easier to be invisible than to argue. But my grandmother had seen me. And she had left me the keys. I looked at my mother, and I said that the will was clear. That I intended to honor what my grandmother wanted. And that I was not interested in selling the building or liquidating the business. I said I planned to keep the Palmetto Table open and to expand the community programs my grandmother had started, the cooking classes for kids in the neighborhood, the Sunday suppers for seniors who lived alone. My brother's expression did not change. But his jaw tightened, and I saw it. He said that was very sentimental of me. I said I would take that as a compliment. I drove home that evening and I sat in my grandmother's kitchen, my kitchen now, and I felt the specific, nauseating clarity of someone who has just realized that the storm they have been watching build on the horizon is now directly overhead. I knew my brother. I knew that what he wanted was not the restaurant itself. He wanted the building, the corner lot, the $3 million that developers would pay without blinking. He needed that money urgently, and I was the only thing standing between him and it. He would come at me. I did not know how. I just knew he would. And I knew my parents would help him. Because they always did. I did something that night that I had never done before. I called a locksmith and changed every lock in the building. I called my grandmother's attorney and asked about the terms of the estate. And then I sat down and I thought, very carefully, about what someone like my brother would do if he needed to remove me as a legal obstacle quickly and cleanly. The answer I kept coming back to made my stomach turn. He would have to make me seem unfit. He would have to build a case that I was unstable, incapable of managing a business, a risk to myself or others. He would need a story that people would believe. And he was, above everything else, extraordinarily good at building stories people believed. That was when I went to my jewelry box and found the locket. It had been a gift from my grandmother on my 7th birthday, a small oval of engraved silver on a thin chain. I had worn it on and off my whole life. I took it to an electronics shop the following morning and I asked the man behind the counter what the smallest recording device he carried was. He showed me something no bigger than a shirt button, with audio quality clear enough to pick up a conversation across a room. I told him I needed it to fit inside a locket. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said he could make that work. 3 days later, I was wearing it again. I went about my life. I opened the restaurant. I did the books. I attended a meeting with a preservation society about the building's historical designation. And I waited. 11 days after the will was read, I arrived at the restaurant at 6 in the morning to find the back door standing open. I knew before I stepped inside. There was something in the quality of the silence, too still, too deliberate. I pushed the door open, and I stood in the doorway, and I looked at what had been done. The kitchen was not destroyed, exactly. It was staged. Someone had pulled the shelves of dry goods partly off the wall and scattered the contents across the prep stations. A bottle of red wine vinegar had been thrown against the tile and left to spread across the floor like a dark stain. The framed photograph of my grandmother that hung above the pass, the one from 1984 where she was laughing with a spatula in her hand, had been knocked down. The glass cracked in a specific, almost decorative way. The damage was not chaotic. It was composed. It told a particular story about a particular kind of person, and that person was supposed to be me. My brother stepped out of the walk-in cooler. He was wearing a dark coat, and he looked immaculate, as he always did. He shook his head slowly, with an expression of such exquisite concern that for a moment I almost felt like I was watching a performance, which of course I was. He said he had gotten an anonymous call that morning. He said he had rushed over immediately. He said he had been so worried about me. That people who knew me had reached out to him privately with concerns. That he had spoken to a doctor friend of his. That it was starting to make sense now. He asked me when I had last slept. I looked at him. I looked at the cracked photograph of my grandmother. I looked at the vinegar spreading across the floor. She had swept herself for 40 years. I said, very quietly, that I would need him to leave. He said he had already called someone. He said he was doing this because he loved me. And then the side door opened, and 2 police officers walked in, and I understood exactly what kind of script I had been handed, and exactly what my next line was supposed to be. I had about 3 seconds to make a decision. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to explain. To point. To show them what he had done. To make them understand. But I could hear how it would sound. I was a woman standing in a damaged kitchen with no witnesses, and my brother was a well-dressed man with a phone full of concerned texts he had probably written to himself the night before. Rage, in that moment, was exactly what he needed from me. A scene. Evidence of instability. The thing he had set this whole stage to produce. I took a breath. I pressed it down. I turned to the officers and I said, calmly and clearly, that I would cooperate fully. I saw my brother's expression flicker. I did not fight the evaluation. I did not cry in the intake room, or refuse to answer questions, or demand to call anyone in a voice that could be described as agitated. I answered every question I was asked with the same flat, steady patience I had used in the restaurant on difficult Saturday nights, when everything was going wrong and the dining room could not know it. When the psychiatrist asked about my sleep, I described it accurately. When she asked about my stress level, I acknowledged it without catastrophizing. When she asked whether I had ever felt like harming myself, I told her the truth, which was no. Not once. Not ever. She looked at me for a long moment. She asked me why I seemed so calm. I told her that I had grown up in a restaurant kitchen. Calm was a professional skill. My attorney, a woman I had called from the intake waiting room before they took my phone, arrived 31 hours later with my full medical history and a certified letter from my grandmother's doctor attesting to my mental competency at the time the will was signed. She was brisk and unhurried, and she used the phrase unlawful detainment in a tone of voice that seemed to lower the room temperature by several degrees. I was released by the end of the second day. When I walked out into the afternoon light, I found my parents waiting on the sidewalk. My mother was dressed in a way I had never seen her dressed before. No jewelry. No silk. Just a plain linen blouse and slacks. Her face bare of the careful makeup she had worn every day of my life. She looked older without it. She looked, almost, like a woman who had been crying genuinely. My father stood behind her with his hands in his pockets, studying the pavement. Between them on the hood of the car was a paper bag that I could smell before I reached them, the particular smell of the peach cobbler from the bakery 3 blocks from my parents' house, the one my grandmother had taken me to on Sunday mornings when I was small. My mother said my name. She said it the way she used to say it when I was a child and had hurt myself. She crossed the space between us and took both of my hands in hers and said that she was so sorry. She said she had not known how far he had gone. She said she had believed him when he told her I had been spiraling, that she had wanted so badly to believe he was worried about me, rather than worried about the money, and that she had been wrong, and she knew she had been wrong. And she was asking me now to give her a chance to make it right. My father said my brother had gone too far. He said they were cutting him off. He said they wanted me to come to Sunday dinner. Just the 3 of us, so they could show me in person that things were going to be different. I stood on that sidewalk and I looked at my mother's face and I felt the pull of it, that old hunger, the part of me that had wanted this exact thing, this specific acknowledgement, this particular tenderness for my entire life. It was powerful. It was real. And it was exactly what it was designed to be. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about the way she used to say that the most dangerous thing in a kitchen was not the heat or the knives, but a recipe that looked right and tasted wrong. I thought about the 40 years she had spent watching my brother charm his way through every consequence and my parents absorb every cost. I thought about the photograph with the cracked glass. The staged kitchen. The 2 police officers. My brother had not acted alone. He never did. I said yes. I said Sunday sounded lovely. I said I would be there at 6. My mother hugged me. My father squeezed my shoulder. They drove away, and I stood on the sidewalk in the afternoon light and I unclasped the locket from around my neck, held it in my palm for a moment, and then put it back on. I spent the next 4 days preparing. Not emotionally. Practically. I met with my attorney and I told her everything, including what I believed Sunday dinner was actually for. She listened without interrupting. She asked me one question, which was whether I was sure. I told her that I was not sure of anything, and that if I was wrong then, I would have a nice dinner with my parents and come home, and if I was right, then I needed to be ready. She said she could be available by phone. I said I hoped I would not need her until Monday. I also spent 2 of those 4 days in the restaurant, going through the security footage I had installed after changing the locks. The system was new enough that my brother had not known about it, or had not thought to check for it, which was the particular arrogance of people who have always been believed without evidence. The footage was clear. It showed him entering through a side window at 4:47 in the morning, moving methodically through the kitchen, placing the damage with the kind of deliberate care that was its own form of confession. It showed him standing in front of my grandmother's photograph for a long moment before he knocked it down, and I watched that part twice. I sent the file to my attorney. I did not tell my brother or my parents that I had it. Sunday came. I dressed carefully. I wore the locket. I drove to my parents' house and I parked on the street and I sat in my car for 3 minutes, breathing, the way I used to sit in my car before a difficult service, when I was a line cook, and the whole night was ahead of me, and I just needed to remind myself that I knew what I was doing. Then I got out, and I went inside. The dining room table was set, the way my mother set it for important occasions, the good china, the silver candlesticks, the centerpiece of magnolia branches she cut from the backyard tree. My father poured wine before I had even sat down. My brother was not there, as promised. My mother brought out the first course, and talked about a neighbor's garden renovation, and my father nodded along, and the 3 of us sat in the gentle fiction of a normal family dinner. The wine was poured. My father raised his glass and said he was glad I was there. I lifted my glass and I brought it close to my face and I breathed in before I drank. Bitter almond. Sweet and faint and unmistakable beneath the tannins, the smell of something that did not belong, something I recognized from a food safety course I had taken years ago, the specific, wrong sweetness of a compound that had no business in a glass of wine. I set the glass down. I pretended to sip. I held the liquid in my mouth and then, when my mother turned toward the kitchen, I pressed my napkin to my lips. 20 minutes later, my parents stopped performing. My brother walked in from the hallway. He sat down at the table, like a man arriving to finalize a transaction. My mother began speaking in a different register, faster and flatter, practical, the voice she used when she was discussing logistics and not feelings. She talked about the power of attorney document. She talked about a doctor friend of my brother's, who was prepared to provide an affidavit. She talked about the offer from the development company, the one that had been sitting on the table for months, and how quickly it could close if the paperwork was in order. She talked about what the money would mean for the family, for stability, for my brother getting back on his feet, for all of us moving forward. She talked about it the way you talk about something that is already decided. I let my body relax into my chair. I let my eyes go a little soft, my head tilt slightly. I let my responses become slower, shorter, agreeable. I watched my brother watch me, and I watched him decide that it was working. And I watched the particular satisfaction of a man who has planned something carefully and sees it coming together on schedule. He slid a document across the table toward me. He handed me a pen. He said all I needed to do was sign, and then we could all move on. I looked at the document. I looked at my parents. I looked at my brother. I put the pen down. I said I grew up in that restaurant kitchen. I said I had learned from the woman who built it with her own hands how to tell the difference between something made with love and something made to look like it. I said I knew the difference between a real recipe and a forgery. And I said that everything they had served me tonight was a forgery, the concern, the reconciliation, the wine. My brother's expression flattened. He said I did not know what I was talking about. He said I was confused. He looked at my parents in the way people look at each other when they are confirming a shared story. And then he reached for the document to take it back. I put my hand on it. I said I had been recording since I arrived. The room went very quiet. On Monday morning, my attorney walked into the probate hearing with 3 pieces of evidence. The security footage from the restaurant, showing my brother staging the damage in the early hours of the morning. The toxicology report from the wine glass I had quietly wrapped in a napkin and brought to a lab the morning after Sunday dinner. And the audio from the locket, 47 minutes of my family's own voices describing exactly what they had planned and exactly why. My brother told the judge it had been fabricated. He said it in the same smooth, measured tone he used for everything. And I watched the judge's face as she listened to him. And I watched the moment she decided she had heard enough. She asked him one question. She asked him whether he could explain why his voice on the recording referred to a document that had not yet been created at the time he claimed the recording was falsified. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. What happened next took several months to fully resolve, as these things do. The charges against my brother were serious and multiple criminal mischief, fraud, conspiracy, a few others that I will not pretend to understand fully, and my parents faced their own accounting for the events of that Sunday evening. The development company's offer expired. The building on the corner lot remained what it had always been. I reopened the Palmetto table on a Tuesday in early spring. I kept the photograph of my grandmother above the pass, frame replaced, glass new. I started the neighborhood cooking classes back up. And I added a second session on Friday evenings for adults who had never learned to cook for themselves. On Sunday mornings, I still make biscuits from her recipe, the one that was written on the back of a church bulletin and has never been written down anywhere else, because some things you learn by doing, not by reading. I wear the locket every day. Not because of what is inside it anymore, I had the recording device removed, but because she gave it to me and because it reminds me that protection and love are not the same thing. Being loved is something you hope for. Being protected is something you build, quietly, before you need it. The restaurant is doing well. I am not. I mean that in the best possible way. I am not the person who absorbed things quietly and called it peace. I am not the person who made herself invisible so that someone else could seem bright. I am not the person who would have sat at that Sunday dinner table and signed something that was not true because she was tired of fighting. I am something more uncomfortable than that now, and more honest, and I will take that over the alternative without hesitation. My grandmother used to say that the secret to a good kitchen was not the equipment or the recipes. It was knowing exactly what you had and refusing to pretend otherwise. She meant it about food. She meant it about everything. I think about that every single morning when I unlock the front door and turn on the lights and the whole room smells like butter and coffee and the particular warmth of a place that has been loved for a long time by people who meant it. I think about it every time someone sits down at one of those tables and exhales like they have been holding their breath all day, and this is the first moment they have been allowed to stop. That is the thing about a place that is really yours. You know it when you are in it. You know it by the way you breathe.